Rose Sharpton's house had long been forgotten by the watchful eyes of the neighborhood. When George Hinojosa moved in with his wife Stacy, he was the first to notice the house's poor condition. The overgrown grass and rusted gate made it seem like time had abandoned the place. As he passed by, George felt a twinge of curiosity, but he quickly brushed it off, assuming the house was vacant. George's routine was peaceful, yet every time he looked out the window, his eyes were drawn to Rose's house. Something bothered him. Days went by until one quiet afternoon he saw a car pull up in front of the house. A man got out, went in quickly, and left just as fast. George watched the movement closely, and his doubt grew. Who was that person? And after all, did someone actually live there? George's curiosity pushed him to go to the house. He knocked on the door and waited. No answer. He knocked again, a little harder this time. Just as he was turning to leave, he heard the heavy sound of a lock being undone. The door slowly opened, revealing an elderly woman. Her wrinkled face and tired eyes contrasted with the gentle smile she tried to give. It was Rose. George was surprised. That frail and lonely woman lived there? He introduced himself, explaining he was the new neighbor. Rose responded kindly, but there was something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. The conversation was brief, filled with silences. Rose mentioned her 3 children with pride, but quickly changed the subject when George asked about her situation. She didn't want to dwell on it. Her once kind gaze took on a hint of shame. When George returned home, he told Stacy about Rose and how strange her situation seemed. Stacy suggested they should keep an eye on her. After all, something wasn't right. The next day, Rose went to the supermarket. With slow steps and a tired posture, she walked through the aisles carefully, choosing what to buy. She picked up only the essentials. When she got to the checkout, she pulled out the money with trembling hands, but it wasn't enough. The cashier looked at her with compassion, but the situation was already humiliating enough. Rose felt her cheeks burn with shame. Stacy was right behind her in line, and when she noticed the elderly woman's embarrassment, she offered to pay the difference. Rose refused out of pride, but reality was relentless. With no other option, she accepted the help, thanking Stacy with tearful eyes. During dinner, Stacy told George what had happened. Rose's situation was even more precarious than he had imagined. The two of them decided something had to be done. George, who had already noticed the strange behavior of the man visiting Rose's house, decided to find out more. That week, George kept an eye on Rose's house, waiting for the next visit from that man. It didn't take long for the same car to return. Determined, George seized the opportunity to approach him. The man was David, Rose's eldest son. When confronted about his mother's condition, David responded evasively, saying that Rose spent too much and that he and his brother were doing their best to help her. However, something about his story didn't quite add up. David became visibly uncomfortable with George's questions and tried to brush him off, insisting that it was a family matter. But George, sensing that something was wrong, refused to back down. He decided to dig deeper. George found out where David worked, and after talking to one of his co-workers, he learned that David and his brother Jeffrey often laughed behind closed doors about how they managed to take some of the money that their younger sister, Helena, was sending. Helena, living abroad, had no idea what was really happening. Meanwhile, David and Jeffrey were living a life filled with parties and shallow pleasures, while their mother could barely make ends meet. Now armed with more information, George knew he had to take more concrete action. He tried asking Rose about Helena, if there was any way to contact her, but Rose avoided the question, seemingly wanting to protect her sons, even though she knew the truth. Determined, George decided to take matters into his own hands. During a visit to Rose's house, while she was distracted, he found an old box filled with documents. Amidst old photo albums and yellowed papers, George came across something important: Helena's phone number and an email address. He immediately tried calling the number, but a man answered, saying there was no Helena at that number. Frustrated, George decided to send an email to Helena, briefly explaining the situation and asking her to get in touch as soon as possible. While waiting for a response, he continued sifting through the papers in the box and found something unexpected: an old newspaper clipping that mentioned a businessman, now deceased, who appeared to be Rose's father. The name of the man was familiar to George. He was a well-known magnate from George's old town, and his inheritance didn't seem to have been properly claimed. This revelation was shocking. If Rose was the legitimate heir, why was she living in such poverty? Determined to uncover the truth, George asked his lawyer to investigate Rose's past and the possible inheritance. The next day, when George opened his email, he found a response from Helena. She seemed alarmed by what he had written and left a phone number for him to call. When he spoke to her, George explained everything he had discovered. Helena was devastated. She had blindly trusted her brothers and never imagined that her mother was suffering in such a way. Helena decided to return to the country immediately, but before doing so, she made a decision that would change everything. She told her boyfriend, John, about the situation. When Helena told John everything, she expected support and sympathy, but his reaction was unexpected. John became more interested in Rose's possible inheritance than in the elderly woman's suffering. He showed discomfort, but instead of suggesting they help, he tried to change the subject, downplaying the seriousness of what was happening. This raised a red flag for Helena, and she began to realize that John might not be the trustworthy person she once believed. As she prepared to return to her home country, Helena started reflecting on John's recent behavior. He always seemed evasive when it came to discussions about money, and now, with the possibility of a large inheritance, his reaction was focused solely on that. Helena then made a decisive move. Without telling John, she packed her bags and booked a flight to go back and protect her mother. On the other side, George, who had become increasingly involved in Rose's situation, started to come up with a plan. He knew that directly confronting David and Jeffrey could be dangerous. If those two were already willing to take money from their own mother, they wouldn't hesitate to act desperately upon discovering the inheritance. George decided they needed a trap. Stacy, always sharp, suggested they create a fake scenario, leaving clues that a meeting with lawyers was about to take place. The idea was for David and Jeffrey to believe that Rose's inheritance was going to be discussed and that money was at stake. The goal was to make them panic and reveal their true intentions. George and Stacy left a note on Rose's door, pretending it was an official letter from lawyers with a clear and provocative message. The note stated that there would be a meeting soon to discuss Rose's inheritance, but only the children who had always taken care of their mother would be present and rewarded. The insinuation was that those who weren't part of the trusted group would be excluded from the fortune. George knew deep down that this provocation would rattle David and Jeffrey. They had been taking money from Rose for years, and they certainly wouldn't hesitate to act to secure an even bigger fortune. The trap was set. While they waited for the brothers' reaction, George and Stacy prepared for the confrontation, now with the support of lawyers and possibly the police. Meanwhile, Helena, already back in her home country, was determined to confront her brothers. However, she still didn't know about John's schemes or the danger that was looming. She decided to make one last attempt to contact John, to see if he truly cared about her mother's situation. His cold response to the matter made her decide, once and for all, to leave him behind. Now, her priority was to save her mother. In the middle of the night, without warning, Jeffrey went to Rose's house. He had received the provocative message and was consumed by panic. Jeffrey knew that if the inheritance was discussed, his despicable actions would come to light and he would be exposed. He needed an advantage, and he needed to hide Rose before Helena returned and before anything else could happen. He entered Rose's house without ceremony. Rose, who still trusted her sons despite everything, didn't ask questions. "Come on, Mom, you're going to stay with me for a few days," he said in a cold tone, hiding the real reason behind his actions. Rose, frail and confused, simply obeyed, unaware of what was about to happen. The next morning, George noticed that Rose's house was empty. A neighbor mentioned that they had seen Jeffrey arrive late at night and leave with Rose. That was enough to raise the alarm for George. He knew something was wrong. He and Stacy quickly gathered the evidence they had and informed Helena, who was already on her way. A sense of urgency took hold of everyone. Jeffrey was planning something big, and now Rose's life could be at risk. On the day of the supposed meeting, David arrived at Rose's house. He was nervous, eager to secure his share of what he imagined to be a large inheritance. To his surprise, when he arrived, he found not only George and Stacy, but also a team of lawyers and 2 police officers who were already aware of the situation. The lawyers had prepared documents exposing David and Jeffrey's fraud and their years of stealing money. Caught off guard, David tried to keep his composure, but the pressure mounted when Helena arrived shortly after. Her face was marked with sadness and anger. She confronted her brother, exposing all his lies, the blatant theft of their mother's money, and worse, the emotional neglect of Rose. The presence of the police made it clear that the accusations were serious. With no way out, David tried to blame Jeffrey, claiming he was the mastermind behind everything, but the lawyers already had enough evidence to implicate him as well. Meanwhile, Stacy revealed that Rose was with Jeffrey, and they needed to act quickly to find her. Knowing he was about to be exposed, Jeffrey took Rose to a distant house, trying to keep everything hidden until he could figure out more about the inheritance. But the pressure was too much. When the lawyers and police arrived at the house where he had hidden Rose, he knew there was nowhere left to run. Rose, confused and frail, watched the confrontation in silence until she finally saw Helena, and tears streamed down her face. She now knew everything. Helena's eyes, full of pain and compassion, were the only thing that calmed Rose. They embraced, as if all the time and suffering could be healed in that moment. Jeffrey and David were taken in for questioning, and the investigations moved forward. With the help of the lawyers, Helena was able to prove that Rose was the sole legitimate heir to the fortune left by her father, a magnate whose will had been ignored for decades due to a series of circumstances. In the months that followed, Rose was relocated to a new home, now under Helena's care, who promised never to leave her mother alone again. Stacy and George remained loyal friends, helping with every step of the recovery process, both emotionally and financially. Helena decided to distance herself from John, realizing that he was part of a cycle of people who only cared about money. She moved forward, focused on rebuilding her life alongside her mother. David and Jeffrey faced the consequences of their actions, losing all contact with their mother and being prosecuted for fraud. As for Rose, she finally found peace. Surrounded by people who truly cared for her, she spent the last years of her life filled with love, security, and dignity. And so, a story marked by abandonment, greed, and pain found its conclusion in a heartfelt embrace between mother and daughter, united by truth and the unbreakable bond of family love. The following months were ones of rebuilding, both for Rose and for Helena. The new house, a cozy and well-kept place, offered a level of comfort that Rose hadn't known in years. But despite the new surroundings, the past had left deep scars. The years of abandonment and neglect still lingered in Rose's mind, and Helena knew it would be a long process before her mother felt truly safe again. Determined to do everything she could, Helena hired professional caregivers and began focusing on better understanding her mother's health. Rose, though physically fragile, possessed an emotional strength that was impressive. Even after everything, she still spoke of David and Jeffrey with a mixture of sadness and longing, as if she still hoped her sons might find redemption. Helena, on the other hand, saw things differently. The years of betrayal and dishonesty from her brothers had built a wall she couldn't break through. George and Stacy continued to be a constant presence in Rose's life. More than just neighbors, they were loyal friends who were there to support and ensure that she never suffered again. One afternoon, while they were having tea in the garden of the new house, Rose looked at Helena and asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you think they'll ever regret it?" Helena, not knowing how to respond, looked away. She knew that for her mother, the hope that David and Jeffrey would one day ask for forgiveness was a way of coping with the trauma. But she herself had learned over time that some wounds don't heal with mere words. The investigations against David and Jeffrey progressed quickly. The police were able to trace all the embezzled money, and both were formally charged with misappropriation and fraud. For the brothers, the trial was a devastating experience. They found themselves completely isolated. Jennifer, Jeffrey's wife, left him as soon as she realized that the easy money was gone, and the friends they had at parties and events disappeared just as quickly as they had arrived. Helena did not attend the court proceedings, but she followed every detail closely. For her, justice was being served, but there was no sense of victory or relief. It was just the closing of a bitter chapter. When the sentence was announced, 5 years in prison for both David and Jeffrey, she felt a void, as if none of it could truly repair the damage done to her mother. Despite everything, Rose followed the trial from a distance with an almost eerie calm. To Helena, this was the reflection of a life dedicated to her children, who, even in the face of the greatest betrayals, still held a place in her mother's heart. It was an unconditional love that Helena admired, but at the same time feared. With the conclusion of the trial, Helena decided it was time to move on. She began to dedicate herself fully to caring for Rose and also to her own professional plans, which had been put on hold for so long as she tried to balance the family situation. Now, with her mother by her side and the problems with her brothers resolved, she could finally breathe. Helena also started to come to terms with the end of her relationship with John. The decision to leave him wasn't easy, but she knew it was the right one. John had shown his true colors, someone who valued money and a comfortable life above all else. Helena realized that if she wanted to build something solid in her life, she needed to be surrounded by people who shared her values and priorities. One sunny afternoon, Helena took Rose for a walk in the park. As they walked slowly, Helena reflected on how much had changed. Now, every moment with her mother was a gift, an opportunity to rebuild the bond that time and distance had almost destroyed. "Thank you for never giving up on me, my daughter," Rose said. Holding Helena's hand gently, "You brought me back to life." Helena smiled, moved, but couldn't find the words. Just having her mother there, by her side, was all that mattered. The wounds of the past were still there, but for the first time in a long time, the future seemed promising. The peaceful days brought new perspectives for both of them. Rose, once trapped in a life of limitations and isolation, began to bloom again. George and Stacy's visits became part of the routine, and the garden of the new house, once neglected, was now full of flowers that Rose and Helena planted together. Helena found a foundation of trust in her neighbor friends, but more importantly, she began to rediscover something she had left behind during the difficult years: her dreams. She resumed the career that had been interrupted by the family crisis, and with George's support, she got involved in projects that made her heart race again. One of those projects connected her directly to the past, helping elderly people in vulnerable situations, like her mother had been for so long. As time passed, a new tranquility settled into Rose's life. She began receiving regular visits from caregivers, but the greatest care came from Helena, who made sure to be by her mother's side every step of the way. The two developed an even closer relationship, built on mutual understanding and affection. Laughter returned to Rose's lips, and the simple joys of small things, a morning coffee, an evening walk, became the true treasures of their lives. Over time, Rose and Helena's story became well known in the community. The support and generosity of George and Stacy, combined with Helena's determination to protect and care for her mother, inspired many. People began to reflect on their own families, their own relationships, and many reconnected with loved ones, seeking to avoid the distance that had nearly destroyed Rose's relationship with her children. Rose, now surrounded by love and dignity, became seen as a symbol of resilience. She, who had endured years of abandonment and suffering, found redemption through her daughter and true friends, a redemption she had long deserved. Helena, in turn, made her mother's story a legacy. By working on projects to help abandoned elderly people, she turned the pain into a force for change. Every new case she helped, every life she touched, was a silent tribute to the struggle Rose had faced. And so, as the years passed, a daughter's love and dedication saved a mother from the grips of abandonment. Together, Rose and Helena finally lived the years they still had the way they should have from the start, in peace, surrounded by affection, and free from any shadows of the past. This was Rose's greatest legacy, not the inheritance nor the money that had been stolen and recovered, but the certainty that true love, once reclaimed, can heal even the deepest wounds. The years passed, and Rose and Helena's home transformed into a refuge of living memories and rediscovered joys. The scars of betrayal and abandonment slowly gave way to moments of laughter, affection, and mutual learning. George and Stacy remained frequent visitors, always bringing a lightness that seemed to lift Rose's spirits, whose resilience had never been fully broken despite the challenges. Helena, now a mature woman fulfilled in both her personal and professional life, occasionally reflected on everything that had happened. Some nights, she would sit with her mother in the garden, gazing at the stars, which seemed to shine brighter in this new chapter of their lives. On those nights, their conversations became more intimate, and the words that were once hard to say finally found their way. "I failed you, Mom. I should have come back sooner," Helena said during one of those moments, her voice choked with the guilt she had never fully been able to abandon. Rose, with the wisdom that only years can bring, simply smiled, gently holding her daughter's hand. "You came back at the right time," Rose replied, "and you brought me back to life when I needed it most. There's no failure in loving like that, my daughter." Those words, spoken with the serenity that only true forgiveness brings, echoed in Helena's heart. She knew her mother's forgiveness was sincere, but the traumatic events had left her with a sense of responsibility that could never be fully erased. However, beside her mother, she found the strength to keep going. While Rose and Helena built their new lives, the fate of the other characters in this story took different paths. David and Jeffrey, imprisoned for their actions, faced the harsh consequences of their choices. The easy money, the parties, the lies, all of it crumbled the moment justice caught up with them. The walls of a cell, however, don't just bring the loss of freedom, they also force an inevitable confrontation with one's own demons. David, who had once lived as a hedonist, found himself surrounded by loneliness. The friends who had joined him in his days of abundance disappeared, and his wife filed for divorce shortly after the trial began. During his time in prison, he reflected on his choices, but the idea of asking for forgiveness from Rose or Helena still seemed too distant. Shame consumed him, and pride stubbornly kept him silent. Jeffrey, on the other hand, was tormented by guilt more intensely. Always the more rational of the two brothers, he began to question how things had gone so far. He knew his behavior had been unforgivable, but he also felt a growing pain from no longer being able to see his mother, whom he had betrayed out of pure greed. Jennifer, who had left him when the money stopped flowing, was now just a bitter memory of a time when he chose selfishness over family love. At some point, both brothers considered the possibility of writing letters to Rose, letters of remorse, attempts at reconciliation. However, neither of them ever managed to put the words on paper. Perhaps because, deep down, they knew that some wounds were too deep to be mended with a belated apology. Rose and Helena's story became a shining example in the community. Helena's work with vulnerable elderly individuals began to gain recognition, and she was invited to speak about the importance of family care and emotional responsibility. More and more, her personal struggle became a symbol of awareness for those who, like her mother, were forgotten by the ones who should have loved them. The assistance program Helena created grew. Funded by donations and Rose's recovered inheritance, the program provided care and support to elderly people who, for various reasons, found themselves abandoned or neglected by their families. With every new case resolved, Helena felt that, in a way, she was giving others the happy ending her mother had earned. One day, while reviewing the program's finances and activities, Helena found a letter among the documents. It was a simple, handwritten letter addressed to her. Upon opening it, she immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from John. He, who had remained abroad, wrote to apologize for everything that had happened. He spoke of how, at the time, his greed had clouded his judgment, and how he regretted not supporting Helena when she needed him most. However, the apology felt hollow to Helena. Years had passed since she left him behind, and now the life she had built was far from the shadows of the past. She did not respond to the letter. The peaceful days Rose lived by Helena's side were many, but time is relentless. Rose's health began to decline gradually, and Helena, always attentive, noticed every sign of frailty. Rose was aging quickly, and though her mind remained sharp, her body was starting to give way. One night, as Helena read a book beside her mother's bed, Rose called her with a soft voice. "Helena, dear, I think the time is coming." Helena felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of fear and acceptance. She knew that her mother had lived a hard life, but in the last few years, she had found the peace and love she so deserved. She held Rose's hand, which felt lighter than ever. "You have been my greatest joy, daughter," Rose said with a weak smile. "And knowing you found your path, that's all I needed." With tears in her eyes, Helena kissed her mother's forehead. Silence filled the room, and slowly, Rose's breathing softened until it faded gently, like a candle at the end of its flame. Rose's funeral was a moment of both sorrow and celebration. Friends and neighbors who had witnessed Rose's strength and kindness over the years gathered to pay their respects. George and Stacy were there, standing beside Helena, who held her mother's hand one last time. In her speech during the ceremony, Helena spoke about the power of love and resilience. She spoke about how Rose had been a quiet warrior who fought against abandonment and pain, but who, in the end, won because she chose forgiveness and love above all else. The social project Helena had started was renamed in her mother's honor, the Rose Sharpton Foundation, caring for those in need. Rose's story would continue to inspire and transform lives far beyond those walls. Helena, now at complete peace, knew she had fulfilled her promise. She not only cared for her mother, but restored the dignity that had been taken from her. Above all, she had restored the most precious bond of all, the unconditional love between mother and daughter. And so the legacy of Rose Sharpton, a legacy of love, forgiveness, and strength, carried on, touching lives, and showing that, in the end, what truly matters are the bonds we build and the hearts we touch throughout our journey.
So, if you're not subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button below and join our community. Thank you for your support and see you in the next videos.